Between April 14th and April 23rd, only 5 cargo shipments left Iranian terminals. A nation that had been exporting 1.84 million barrels per day in March suddenly saw its daily outflow drop to barely 1/4 of that figure. The oil that could no longer find buyers had nowhere to go but into storage, and tanks began filling at an alarming pace. From April 13th to April 21st alone, Iran's oil reserves rose by more than 6 million barrels. At Kar Island, Iran's main export hub responsible for nearly 90% of crude shipments, storage tanks reached 74% capacity by April 20th. For operational safety, oil companies typically avoid surpassing 80%. The countdown had officially begun. Kepler analysts projected that Iran's usable storage could be exhausted within 12 to 22 days if the blockade persisted. The Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy reached conclusions almost identical to Kepler's. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bassent left no room for ambiguity. On April 22nd, he wrote on X, "In just days, Kar Island storage will be full, and the delicate Iranian oil wells will have to be shut in." In a follow-up post, Bassent spelled out the stakes with precise language that sent shockwaves through Tehran. Storage reaching full capacity would force Iran to cut oil production, inflicting an extra $170 million in daily lost revenue and inflicting permanent harm on oil infrastructure. The word permanent alone should have kept every Iranian official awake at night. This was no longer merely about short-term revenue loss. It was about irreversible damage looming tomorrow. Antoine Hall, co-founder of energy intelligence firm Kepler, clarified the situation. Once aging oil wells are shuttered, restarting them is extraordinarily difficult, often impossible. Analysts now estimate permanent production losses could range between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. In petroleum engineering, this is termed irreversible production loss. A blockade long enough doesn't simply hurt Iran's economy, it amputates it. What distinguishes this operation from anything seen in modern history is that it is far more than a blockade. It is a meticulously engineered trap. While the U.S. Navy seals Iran's export routes, any vessel attempting to defy the blockade is tracked, intercepted, and if necessary, boarded. The era when Iranian tankers could switch flags, disable AIS transponders, and vanish is over. A deactivated transponder is no obstacle for the full intelligence machinery of U.S. Central Command. Through Sentinel satellites, AWACS surveillance aircraft, and advanced maritime tracking systems, each vessel is monitored individually. Voyages are documented, destinations known. Since the blockade began, CENTCOM has confirmed at least 39 ships redirected. 3 vessels, the MV Tuska, the MTFI, and the MT Majestic X, were seized and remain in U.S. custody. On April 28th, Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit intercepted the Comoro-flagged MV Blue Star 3 in the Gulf of Oman. They fast-roped onto the ship, conducted a thorough search, and released it only after confirming no Iranian oil was aboard. The message was unmistakable. Even Chabahar, Iran's so-called Plan B on the Gulf of Oman, which Tehran had spent billions developing over years for precisely this scenario, has become ineffective. Over 20 tankers and cargo ships now sit stranded at Chabahar. What was intended as Iran's emergency outlet has turned into a floating parking lot. 6 fully loaded Iranian tankers linger outside the port, trapped by the extended American blockade. This is no longer a mere sanctions enforcement. It is surgical, high-tech strangulation, the likes of which Iran never anticipated. The trap tightens each day. Chabahar, once touted as Iran's strategic trump card, has been burned entirely. For years, Thrawn promoted it as insurance against a Hormuz blockade. Located outside the Strait of Hormuz on the Gulf of Oman, the port was meant as an alternative export hub. India invested heavily, and China and Russia backed it as part of the international north-south transport corridor. Iran presented it as a gateway to the world, a bypass that would render any Hormuz shutdown ineffective. Today, that gateway has turned into a graveyard of immobilized ships. Satellite imagery shows 6 oil-laden tankers clustered just outside Chabahar, trapped within the American naval cordon extending deep into the Gulf of Oman. The ultimate blow came when India, one of Iran's most critical remaining partners, quietly withdrew. After years of investment in Chabahar, New Delhi abandoned its commitments and signed a major contract with the UAE's Fujairah oil terminal. In a single calculated move, India shifted its strategic reliance away from Iran toward the safer, more reliable UAE ports. Iran's connection to Asia is now being forsaken by its own partners. This is not merely a tactical defeat, it is strategic collapse. Exit routes are closing one by one. While the naval blockade tightened at sea, an even more consequential shift occurred on land. On April 28, 2026, the United Arab Emirates delivered a political shockwave. After nearly 6 decades of membership dating back to 1967, the UAE officially announced its departure from OPEC and the wider OPEC Plus alliance, effective May 1st. The timing was deliberate and devastating. Abu Dhabi chose the middle of a historic energy crisis for its exit, precisely when cartel coordination should have been most crucial. UAE Energy Minister Su Al-Mazouer explained to CNN that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz minimized the immediate market impact of their announcement. In other words, Abu Dhabi timed this move to maximize its post-crisis freedom of action. By leaving OPEC, the UAE can independently increase production toward 5 million barrels per day by 2027 without quota restrictions. Its oil has a direct, secure path to market that bypasses the strait entirely via the 380-kilometer Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, which has already seen exports jump 57% since March. This single decision threatens to inundate global markets with oil beyond the reach of Iran's blockade. OPEC's control of global supply has already fallen from approximately 30% to 26%. High oil prices, one of the last buffers for Iran's shadow exports, now face severe pressure. Iran is losing both volume and price simultaneously, a perfect two-front economic collapse. The UAE's departure was far more than a policy shift. It is a strategic dagger aimed at Iran's remaining leverage. After nearly 60 years as a founding member, the UAE formally exited OPEC and OPEC Plus on April 28, 2026, with the change effective May 1st. The timing was precise. Amid the worst energy crisis in years, Abu Dhabi broke ranks. Su Al-Mazouer articulated the rationale bluntly. The Strait of Hormuz closure would cushion market reaction, allowing the UAE to position itself for total autonomy in a post-crisis world. Leaving OPEC enables production expansion toward 5 million barrels per day by 2027, without quota limits, with a secure direct route via the 380-kilometer Habshan-Fujairah pipeline. The UAE now moves 8 million barrels per day straight to the Gulf of Oman, completely circumventing the Strait of Hormuz. Since March 2026, this pipeline has already seen a 57% increase in exports. For Tehran, this is a nightmare scenario. Iran is not only unable to move its own crude, but a major OPEC producer is now free to saturate the market with volumes Iran cannot touch. OPEC's overall influence on global oil pricing has fallen from roughly 30% to just 26%. The high oil prices that previously offered Iran some breathing room against sanctions are now directly threatened. The political implications run even deeper. During this conflict, the UAE has suffered the most among Iran's neighbors. Its energy facilities repeatedly came under missile and drone attacks from Iranian forces. The Habshan gas complex and the Fujairah oil terminal were both hit directly. Yet, as an OPEC member, the UAE remained part of the very organization that included its aggressor. Leaving OPEC was Abu Dhabi's definitive message. We will no longer coordinate energy policy with a nation actively bombing our infrastructure. This move was a formal institutional separation. For Iran, this betrayal cuts deeper than any American strike. The UAE was more than a neighbor. It was supposed to be part of the resistance bloc against Western influence. That illusion is gone. Economically, the effects compound rapidly. Iran is losing export volumes due to the blockade. At the same time, rising UAE output undermines price support, and diplomatic leverage erodes as former partners quietly retreat. Domestically, pressure is mounting toward a breaking point. Around April 27, 2026, Iran's Supreme National Security Council convened an emergency closed-door session, led by Secretary Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Leaks reported by Iran International revealed a stark reality. The regime's security agencies offered no optimistic scenarios or fallback plans. Instead, they delivered an unvarnished assessment. Domestic collapse is now a tangible threat. Protests could erupt within days. The regime might withstand the ongoing blockade for no more than 6 to 8 weeks. By the end of spring, nearly 2 million jobs in oil, petrochemical, and steel sectors could be lost. For a government that built its legitimacy on the myth of invincibility, this admission is devastating. Inside that April 27th meeting, multiple sources reported that Iran's security agencies laid bare an extraordinary reality. Rather than hopeful projections or contingency strategies, they painted a critical, pessimistic picture within a regime that has spent 47 years promoting a fortress economy and resistance narrative. 3 conclusions dominated the discussion. First, widespread protests could flare within days. Second, the regime could survive the economic blockade only for 6 to 8 weeks at most. Third, by the close of spring, roughly 2 million private sector jobs might vanish. Officials highlighted the closure of major industrial operations in oil, petrochemicals, and steel. Iranian steel exports have completely stopped, and recovering from recent strikes on key facilities could take years. The 6-day internet blackout wiped out income for about 20% of workers reliant on digital employment. Banks, stock exchanges, and currency markets were largely frozen, effectively paralyzing the remaining economic activity. Most chillingly, security agencies concluded that renewed protests are not just probable, they are inevitable. The only uncertainty is the precise timing. This was no assessment by foreign intelligence. It was Iran's own security apparatus delivering an unflinching reality check to the leadership. The streets may soon rise against the regime. The backdrop makes this even grimmer. Before the war, Iran's economy was already fragile. The World Bank projected contraction in both 2025 and 2026, with inflation trending towards 60%. The Iranian rial had lost half its value between July 2024 and March 2025. Food price inflation exceeded 70% in 2025. Protests swept all 31 provinces in late December 2025, driven purely by economic desperation. Now, add the blockade. Add collapsing oil revenues. Add industrial shutdowns. Add medicine prices rising nearly 60% as imports dwindle. Add long queues for bread, meat, and milk in cities where nighttime power outages are becoming common. Security forces are on heightened alert, especially ahead of International Workers' Day on May 1st. Labor groups demand higher wages, the release of detained activists, and the right to form independent unions. The Supreme National Security Council reportedly warned that any major protest during ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations could pose an existential threat to the Islamic Republic itself. Let that sink in. Iran's highest security body is now openly discussing the survival of the Islamic Republic. This represents the deepest structural crisis the regime has faced since 1979. The fortress economy myth is collapsing in real time. The resistance narrative is now being tested against the stark reality of storage tanks filling faster than they can be emptied. Yet some hardliners still cling to the belief that the United States will eventually back down. They continue to hope that the Hormuz card retains some strategic value. But the arithmetic is brutal. Each week the blockade persists. Iran's structural position deteriorates, not in cycles, but permanently. Damage to oil wells, industrial infrastructure, currency stability, and public trust does not vanish with a ceasefire. It accumulates. The regime's own 6 to 8 week estimate may mark the threshold at which economic pain becomes politically unmanageable. The question is no longer whether Iran faces trouble, it is how long it can endure before something gives. 3 paths lie ahead. First, Iran could return to negotiations with meaningful nuclear concessions and agree to strict IAEA inspections, representing a significant strategic defeat for IRGC hardliners. Second, the blockade may continue, triggering domestic unrest. 2 million workers could lose jobs, subsidies collapse, and the regime might struggle to pay its security forces. Third, the United States could escalate militarily, with political pressure in Washington demanding a decisive outcome. Regardless of the route, one fact is unmistakable. Iran confronts the deepest structural crisis in its 47-year history. The fortress economy narrative is finished. The resistance mythology is being dismantled, not by bombs, but through the quiet inevitability of full storage tanks and sealed shipping lanes. For decades, Iran threatened the Strait of Hormuz, while the world quietly constructed pipelines. Iran vowed to deny oil revenues, and the U.S. Navy built a blockade. Iran financed proxies with oil money, and the blockade cut those funds. When assumptions collapse, myths die. This myth is now dying one lamp at a time. The strategic chessboard in the Gulf has reached a point where every move carries irreversible consequences. The economic siege tightens, domestic pressure mounts, and the diplomatic runway narrows. How this ends, whether through surrender, unrest, or escalation, will reshape Middle Eastern power architecture for the next generation.